I'm just turning my phone off just in case anyone else wants to join me and checking your sounds or such. Um, just making sure.
Members, we are now live on YouTube.
All right. So we're going to wait just a few more moments. We have a few more folks connecting in. I see folks coming in. Good morning. All right. Welcome. Good morning for those of you just joining. Good morning. We're live on YouTube and we are about to get started officially. We just want to wait for a couple more folks to join in this morning. But it's great to see the beautiful faces early. How much coffee do you need? That's really the question. That's really the question. Great to see everyone. Lindsay, how long do you think we should hold before we get started? Should we wait till we have a few more folks or?
Yes, let's maybe wait. I think we have a few people joining now.
Okay.
2 more joining now. Let's maybe wait 1 more minute.
Okay. Great. Good morning for those just joining. Good morning. We are streaming live and excited to have everyone on. We get started in just another minute. Just wanted to say good morning. We see folks coming in. Good morning. Good morning. All right. I think we've got most of our crew. Maybe missing a few people, but I think we have mostly everyone. All right. Well, we'll do an official roll call, but right now it feels like we have most of our crew. Lindsay, what do you think about getting started?
That sounds great.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. Bonjour. I am Colette Pichon Battle. It's so great to see so many faces that I know and some faces that I am looking forward to getting to know. Just to go over a little bit of meeting logistics. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the internet. We just got word that we're up and moving on YouTube. And so that is live. Please leave your camera on and be present in the meeting. Please include your affiliation in your Zoom name to help others identify who's speaking. So you can take the time to change your Zoom name now if you want by going to the little 3 dots in your picture, clicking, and in the drop down menu, there's a rename. You can rename yourself. Please keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking. This is going to help with the audio quality and just helps folks to follow who's talking. We're going to ask that you use the chat box for any technical difficulties, but questions and other issues, please verbalize them. We want to sort of save the chat for the technical issues that we might have. And we've got some support from the governor's staff, making sure that we're okay there. We're going to ask that you hold your questions until the end of the agenda item to allow for a smooth transition. And I'll hand it to Lindsay, actually, a disclaimer about meeting disruption. I think that means don't disrupt the meeting, but what does that mean, Lindsay, meeting disruption?
That means that if we do have a Zoom bombing or any type of interruption in the meeting, then we'll just shut down the meeting and reconvene at another time. I feel like nowadays we have to make that disclaimer just in case.
That's right. That's right. Thank you for that. So we'll figure that out if that happens. Hopefully it will not. And the good news is that folks have gotten notice that public comments are being accepted before and during the live stream of the meeting. So comments may be submitted to climate@la.gov. That's climate@la.gov. And in the subject line of the email, please include reference to the Equity Advisory Group. We want to make sure it gets to the right place. So in the subject of your email, please include a reference to the Equity Advisory Group and the agenda item number. The body of the message should include your name and address before you comment. We'll talk a little bit more about public comment at the end, where they will be read into the record. So I think that is it for meeting logistics, just to get everyone warmed up. That was a little meeting logistics with your coffee. So I'm also just really excited to see everyone. I see we have a few more folks who just joined in. Good morning. We're live, we're going. Great to see you, great to have you. We're gonna just keep this boat moving. So I'm gonna hand it over to Lindsay to just do a roll call and get us started deeper into our agenda.
Thank you, Chair. So members, as I state your name, please unmute yourselves and note if you're here. Colette Pichon Battle.
Here.
Chief Sherelle Parfait Dardar.
Here.
Charles Allen.
Here.
David Robinson Morris.
Here.
Dr. Kenny Cole.
Here.
Liz Williams Russell.
Here. Sorry, my mute button got away from me.
Jasmine Brown.
Here.
Steve Cochran.
Here.
Dr. Craig Colton.
I'm here. Good morning, everyone.
Ashley Gardier.
Here, good morning.
Larry Saraparu. Members, we have a quorum for today.
Thank you, Lindsay. And again, one more time, just good morning, everyone. Thank y'all for being here, for serving on this committee. Let's go to just an official technical piece here, which is just to approve the agenda. And I would like to ask each of you, you should have received the agenda. It is on the screen as well. And I would like to ask for a motion to approve this agenda. Thank you. I heard Steve.
Second.
Thank you, Charles, for the second. And all in favor of approving this agenda, please unmute yourself and say aye.
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 And if you are opposed, please unmute yourself and say opposed or nay. Great. I think we have a good motion on our agenda, and that passes with all votes in favor. All right, so that was the technical piece, and now let me just take a moment to introduce myself again. Again, my name is Colette Pichon Battle. I'm the Executive Director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy with our main office in St. Tammany Parish. Our organization works across the 5 Gulf South states with communities of color on the front line of climate change, and we work to make structural shifts toward climate justice and ecological equity. I'm a graduate of the Southern University Law Center, a 2019 Obama Fellow, a 2018 Echo and Green Fellow, and all of this has been for my work on climate change with communities of color in particular. I'm a proud daughter of the Bayou and a member of this Climate Initiatives Task Force, and honored to serve as the chair of this equity committee. I want to offer my sincere gratitude to those of you who've agreed to serve on this equity committee and members of the Louisiana public engaging in the decisions about the future of our state as we acknowledge and deal with the current climate crisis and the consequences that we still have yet to face as a state, as a nation, and as a human race. I'm worried about our state and her people and the environment that protects all of us. I'm concerned about inequality and what it will mean in the face of climate disaster and opportunity. I'm hopeful, however, that we've got the right leadership in Governor Bell Edwards, his staff, and members of the task force who are ready to face this challenge together with an understanding that people, for better or worse, are part of the environment. We have a moral duty to address this climate crisis, like our lives and the lives of our children and grandchildren depend on it, because they do. We have a lot of work to do, so we shall do it. Let's begin our process with our eyes and hearts open and with hope for the future driving us and Louisiana forward. I'd love to take a moment to just hear from each and everyone on the committee, just saying hello with a short introduction. And I'm going to ask Lindsay to help by calling your name, and you can just offer a brief introduction of yourself just so we can get to know each other. So Lindsay, can I ask you to please go down the roll? And I'm going to ask each of the members to just do a quick introduction.
That's great. Chief Sherrill.
Good morning, everybody, and honor and blessings to you all. Very thankful to be here with all of you today. I am Chief Sherrill Parfait Dardar, Chief of the Grand Cayuga Band of Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw Tribe. I am also seated as the Secretary and one of the founding members of the First Peoples Conservation Council of Louisiana. I am the Chairwoman of the Louisiana Governor's Office of Indian Affairs Native American Commission. I'm also seated as the Vice Chairwoman for the Terrebonne Diversity and Inclusion Task Force. And the majority of my work is centered around environmental and human rights advocacy, because our children are our future and we should do everything possible to ensure the continuance of their lives and their success. So thank you for having me here with all of you today.
Thank you, Chief. Charles Allen.
Good morning. Charles Allen, Community Engagement Director with the National Audubon Society, and also a member of the Mississippi River Delta Coalition, a local coalition of 5 different nonprofits trying to lead efforts to restore our Louisiana ecosystem and coastal wetlands. And in particular, over the last few years, I've worked within the realm of Audubon's initiative focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And within the last year, have worked as a co-lead with several other MRD colleagues to launch a similar initiative within our Mississippi River Delta Coalition. And I'm very pleased to be with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. David Robinson Morris.
I am Dr. David Robinson Morris. I'm the founding director for the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit at Xavier. I'm also the assistant vice president for development at Xavier and an assistant professor in education. I will be leaving my post at Xavier to head over to the Oshner family at the beginning of the year, working in their diversity and equity initiatives. The Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit was founded to improve practice, to impact policy, and to uplift the human spirit in the areas of PK-16 ed equity, of criminal legal system reform, and environmental justice. This is important work to all of us and to every human being on the planet, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Dr. Kenny Cole.
Hey, good morning. I'm Kenny Cole. I'm a physician, internist, and infectious disease specialist by training. Now working with Oxford Health in a role that really is about trying to transform and redesign healthcare delivery, especially to deliver better population health and correct some of the dramatic disparities, healthcare disparities that exist in Louisiana.
Thank you, Kenny. Liz Williams-Russell.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see everyone here. And it's an honor to be here. I am Liz Williams-Russell. I'm the Climate Justice Program Director at Foundation for Louisiana. Foundation for Louisiana was founded as Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation in the days following Hurricane Katrina, meant to be a philanthropic intermediary that could get resources out on the ground to communities that were being left out of the traditional philanthropic response, as well as our institutional responses to disaster. Within the climate justice portfolio, we fully recognize that climate change and our institutional responses to it have a strong tendency to exacerbate existing inequities. And so it's really important that we engage and intervene in ways that ensure equitable and just outcomes to build a more healthy and vibrant Louisiana. We're also very explicit about the ways in which institutionalized racism and practices are built into policies and practices that are then exacerbated. And so most of our work is to directly intervene in in terms of economic opportunity, environmental justice, and equitable development in the face of a changing climate. It's great to be with you all here today.
Thank you, Liz. Jasmine Brown.
Good morning, everyone. I am Jasmine Brown. I am the Public Policy Manager here at the Greater New Orleans, Inc. We are a regional economic development organization in which we serve the 10 parish footprint of Southeast Louisiana. Our mission here at Greater New Orleans, Inc. is to create a region with a thriving economy and an excellent quality of life for everyone. And so within that, there are many things that fall within that umbrella for us, but relevant to this conversation. I lead our coastal efforts as well as our economic mobility efforts. So this work today and through the work of this task force is the perfect marriage of what I am endeavoring to do and accomplish through my work here at GNO Inc. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jasmine. Steve Cochran.
Hey, everybody. Very nice to be here. I have a couple of roles that are relevant here. I am Associate Vice President at the Environmental Defense Fund for Coastal Resilience. That means I run our national coastal program. And then here in New Orleans, where I live, I manage the director of the coalition that Charles Allen just described, a group of 5 environmental groups that are all working on coastal restoration and protection. I'm a member of the governor's Coastal Advisory Commission and of the Coastal Advisory Team for the Coastal Master Plan, part of EDF's Environmental Justice Committee. And prior to moving into the role that I have down here in New Orleans for EDF, I also managed our national and international climate program before stepping onto the adaptation side, which is where I am now. So I very much appreciate being a part of this and really look forward to what we can do together. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Dr. Craig Colton.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure being with this group. I'm Craig Colton. I'm a professor of geography at LSU, and I've been doing more academic-oriented work on environmental justice for well over 2 decades, although much of my work also has an applied focus. And what I've been doing for the last number of years is try to bring people into the conversation on all matters coastal. Sometimes we overemphasize the science and forget that people are involved here, so I really appreciate the opening statement that people are part of the environment from our chairperson. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to working with everyone.
Thank you, Craig. Ashley Gardier.
Good morning, everybody. I serve as a senior advisor to PolicyLink President and CEO Michael McAfee. We're a national research and action institute really focused on racial and economic equity. Honored really to be serving here, but also doing the work at PolicyLink. It has absolutely been a pleasure over the last 15 years to serve both in the Landry administration, to serve as a part of the leadership team at the New Orleans Business Alliance. And the work there was really focused on, again, advancing racial and economic equity for the people of New Orleans and our region. And I'm really just excited to continue to support that work through this advisory group. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Ashley. And Chair, that is all of our members.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and thank you, members. We will have some time later in our agenda to talk about what we're bringing to the table, what our objectives are. But thank you for those introductions. We'll get to know each other. We're missing just a few folks, but they will come in and we will take the time to meet the other members of our committee as well. Let me turn it over to Lindsay to just take us through a little bit of a deeper understanding around the task force charge, the structure of the process, and the timeline. Lindsay, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Colette. My name is Lindsay Cooper, and I work in the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. Our team is staffing the Climate Initiatives Task Force, as well as serving as the chair of the task force. and then working alongside of all of these subgroups, all of the sector committees and advisory groups to staff and to assist the co-chairs and the chairs in executing the mission of each of the groups. So today I'll be giving you a presentation on defining a bit of the problem first. Why are we here? What are we brought together to do? And then what is the vehicle through which we'll address that problem? So the Climate Initiatives Task Force more broadly, and then diving into what does that mean for this advisory group? And so what is the charge of our group? And we'll have a robust discussion around what that charge should be, and then dive into how to scope climate equity. So Colette will provide a broader definition on equity, and then we'll think through how does that fit into the context of climate change in Louisiana and in this effort more specifically. Then I'll jump back into a little bit on the planning process of how we will reach our deliverables and work through all of the pieces of our structure. And then we'll finish with a discussion of our objectives for this group. So what is fundamentally important to us? And we'll also talk through some next steps before we go into our public comment at the end. So let's start with defining the problem. We are brought together today by an executive order of the governor that establishes the charge and the vision that Louisiana can and will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to limit the impacts of climate change. And this vision offers the two fundamental realities that we live with in Louisiana. First, that we're extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and that is severely harming our state's natural and cultural heritage. And so we must address and mitigate those impacts through reducing emissions. But that perspective must also be balanced with our leadership role in industry that the nation depends upon, our jobs depend upon, our economies depend upon. So a lot of what this effort will confront is dealing with these two realities that we have in Louisiana. So in that executive order that the governor laid forth his vision, and he also set emission reduction goals for Louisiana. So you might have seen other states, about half of the United States and some other countries that have adopted these emission reduction goals. And this is a 26 to 28% reduction from 2005 levels by 2025. And then we have an interim goal of 40 to 50% reduction by 2030, and that final goal of net carbon neutrality by 2050. And having these goals set from the beginning of the effort in the governor's executive order gives us clear direction on what we're working towards. So there's no guessing about what our goals are. We have quantitative measures of if we're meeting emission reductions or not. So this effort focuses on the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, but we also understand that adaptation and resilience are also part of the discussion, and we can't have one without the other. But with that, I'll say that in Louisiana, we also have other adaptation efforts, as was mentioned with the Coastal Master Plan and our adaptive governance initiatives, but we do understand the interconnected nature of these. So the work of the task force and all the subgroups, including this group, will all work to set Louisiana on a trajectory to meet our emission reduction goals. So everything that we're doing in these groups is intended to set us on a path to reach our goals. So why did we choose emission reduction goals, and why did we choose those specific goals? I think simply put, we need to reverse the impacts of climate change in Louisiana by reducing our emissions. Human activities are responsible for 1 degree warming of Celsius, already above pre-industrial levels. And we're set to see another 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming over the coming decades. And so we need to do our part and reduce our emissions, not only to minimize climate-related risks on our health, our livelihoods, our economies, our food security, but also lower the need to adapt to climate change. And we chose these specific goals because international climate science has shown that these measures are effective to reduce our emissions and limit this warming. So diving into what it means to do our part, let's first put Louisiana in the context of other states. So as you can tell from this graphic from the World Resources Institute, Louisiana now ranks 8th in total emissions across all states. So we're closely tied with New York in this graphic, as you can see. And that highlights how great our emissions are per capita. Louisiana's population is much smaller than New York's. If we dive a bit deeper into that point, comparing Louisiana to other states in emissions per GDP and in emissions per capita, Louisiana ranks 4th among other states in emissions per GDP. And then we see Louisiana ranks 5th in emissions per capita in the graphic on the right. So there's a need to recognize the difference of emissions in Louisiana from other states. We need to acknowledge our reliance on industry, that the nation depends on the energy produced in Louisiana, our state jobs and economies, and even our local municipalities depend on these industries. But that also comes with impacts, and we need to address the impacts that come with that. So knowing that Louisiana has these higher emissions, and this comes with impacts, we need to understand why we must undertake this effort. So we are already seeing many impacts of climate change in Louisiana. This is not new, but this is also not going away. As you can see in the graphic on the right, the impacts that we are seeing from climate change will only become more extreme in the coming decades, not in a linear line, but in exponential growth. So as outlined by the National Climate Assessment here, we are experiencing increasing heat and worsening air qualities in our cities. Infrastructure risk from flooding is worsening, and that has disproportionate impacts on those in lower income and minority neighborhoods, where drainage systems are poorer and less frequently cleaned out and updated. And we're also very familiar with this second point in Louisiana, that exacerbating flood risk affects our communities, particularly lower-lying communities. It's a reality in Louisiana, too, that poorer communities are generally more frequently lower-lying and less able to protect themselves, and subsequently less able to recover from flooding damages. And as I mentioned, you can see in this graphic on the right, where we'll only continue to see these increases of high tide flooding scenarios. The National Climate Assessment also notes that climate change will cause drought and warming winter temperatures and extreme rainfall. We see all of these already in Louisiana. And these patterns not only overpower our infrastructure, as we talked about on the last slide, but this also impacts the seasonality of our agriculture, the distribution of our seafood and fishery industries, the ability to live along our coast, and the ability to recover from storms. I think it's important to note here the detriment to rural regions as well in that fourth point. In our rural regions in Louisiana are many, and they will face very different risks than our cities do. And Louisiana is a rural state that is frequently poorer and more minority communities as well. And that needs to be understood here too, a little bit differently in how climate change impacts their livelihoods. And the last thing I'll note on this slide is that this graphic in the bottom left notes that heat will affect the ability to work outside, particularly in the Southwest. This will affect laborers being able to perform their jobs in agriculture, forestry, transportation, in seafood and fisheries, and many other industries that require these outdoor activities. It will change how often and how frequently they are able to work outside. So if it's not clear enough from the last two slides, this is a problem for us. Even noting the impacts of climate change as they are now is a problem for us. And this is changing the landscape of Louisiana. And I'll emphasize here how these are all interconnected systems, which means that we have cascading impacts that threaten essential services in our ecosystems, our economies, our environment. So the rising seas and increasing intensity of storms is not separated from the increased stress on urban infrastructure, the greater burden on rural communities, and the rapid population shifts. I believe all this shows that we can't adequately minimize the impacts of climate change unless we address the root cause through reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to mitigate our impact to ensure that our efforts to adapt are successful. we just talked through the extreme challenges that our state faces, but now let's talk through what we can do about it. Setting the climate emission goals is our launch pad, but on its own, that's not enough. We need a path to attain them. So we know these are lofty goals in Louisiana, but they're certainly attainable if we have a strategy and a path to do so. And in the executive order that the governor created to set forth that vision and those emission reduction goals, he also created the Climate Initiatives Task Force to do just that. And just as a reminder, this is the vision that we are working towards, that we would reduce our emissions, avoid the worst impacts of climate change, improve the welfare of our residents, and maintain our leadership. Here's a look at the composition of the task force that was established in the executive order. This group is a 23-member body from state and local government, from nonprofits, environmental groups, industry, communities, and other representatives. And this group will function to shape the overall vision and direction of this climate effort. But in bringing together such a broad group of people, we know it's important to set forth values as we begin these conversations. We held the first task force meeting in early November and laid forth these 5 values that we wanted to make sure guide our effort. And I think it's also important that as the Equity Advisory Group, we consider these in our discussions, because this is also a broad group of members that represent a lot of different backgrounds. And it's important that we root our discussions in respect for the voice of others, and that we hold conversations with integrity, knowing that it is imperative in this effort for us to understand the voices of others and work together. So we must also maintain transparency through clearly voicing our objectives and perspective in a manner that includes others and that encourages and facilitates an open process for the public. And as we move throughout this process, we want to make decisions based on consensus and on science-based evidence. That is what should be driving the decisions that are made. And so that's why we have set up a process that encourages a science-based and consensus-driven decision. But we also know that 23 members on a task force that meets monthly is not enough to reduce Louisiana's emissions. We need a broader group of people engaged in these discussions. And for this reason, we have created subgroups, 10 subgroups under the task force to help us reach these goals. And so you can note in the green boxes are advisory groups, 4 advisory groups that we believe represent tenets that are important across all of the discussions. And we need expertise to just inform us on these components. And so this is, one of these is science, that we're making decisions based on the most up-to-date and accurate science, and that our decisions are based in substantial evidence. Another component is equity, which is this group, to anticipate opportunities to increase equity and reduce inequities that have been produced from climate change. Another advisory group is finance, to ensure there's consideration of financial feasibility and economic opportunities in our strategies, that we're being realistic and understanding the full landscape. And lastly, in legal, that we understand the legal mechanisms that are needed to leverage in creating emission reduction strategies. And alongside those 4 advisory groups, there are also 6 sector-based emission committees. And these are noted in the blue bubbles. And we thought it was important to dive into these different emission sectors and to consider reduction measures, sources, and sinks in all of these different groups. And so they're going to have more specific conversations. To note the roles of each, as we've talked about a little bit already, the sector committees will function primarily to scope their emission sources and sinks in their sector. That'll be the launching point for them. And then as we move into 2021, they will develop and evaluate emission reduction strategies for their specific sector. And committees will interact with advisory groups who will evaluate the strategies through their subject matter lens, and also provide expertise to the committees and task force on their specific subject matter lens. And as I mentioned, the task force steers the overall direction of the climate initiative. They'll also approve the draft and final reports. So all of these groups and also our staff, which is the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities, as I mentioned, alongside the Water Institute of the Gulf, who will be helping us through this planning process. We will all be working towards these set deliverables. So the interim report and a final report were framed in the Governor's executive order as well to ensure that we are working quickly to meet these goals. We know that 2025 is coming very soon, and if we don't create a plan now, we won't be able to reduce emissions for that goal. And so these are our near-term goals. The interim report will focus on the basis of the effort, and the final report will lay out the emission reduction strategies for Louisiana that will set us on a launching pad to meet some of our short, medium, and long-term goals. And so these are short timelines. The interim report is due in about a month and a half, and then the final report will be due in less than 14 months. And you can note sandwiched in the middle is an update to the state greenhouse gas inventory. The last inventory was done in 2010 with 2005 data. So that's great for the baseline from which we're reducing emissions, but we need to understand where do we stand now with our emissions. So as the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities, we're working alongside other agencies to commission this inventory update from the LSU Center for Energy Studies. So diving a bit deeper into the deliverables, here is a timeline and a few of the steps that we'll take to reach this final report. I won't go through everything on these slides, but I think it's important to note that though it's a short timeline, we do have a process in place to meet these near-term deliverables. And so this process will ensure that we remain on track, that we don't get stuck in one step, and that we're grounded in, but not constrained by, process. So I'd like to note a few things on here. You can see the interim report, the inventory update, and the final strategy are all highlighted in blue here. But also as we get into the new year, there will be a call for a public solicitation of emission reduction proposals, where we'll encourage the public, as well as the committees and the advisory groups, to submit emission reduction proposals to the various sector committees. And that will be based on the sector committee scopes that are being defined now and also their objectives. And so we'll spend much of the spring and summer categorizing, then outlining, and then diving into the strategy in those different committees. And that will form the basis of the final report. And so I'll also outline, you can see in the fall of 2021, there will be a trade-offs analysis, and that will allow us to evaluate all of these strategies together. We don't want to create 6 mini climate strategies. We want our groups and committees to overlap, and we want to note that there is a lot of overlap and bleeding over in these committees. So it's important that our strategies are complementary and effective in that way. Zooming into the interim report, since this is a little bit closer in the near term, this will focus on defining the climate problem in Louisiana first. So what is the full scope of that problem? And then we'll dive into the mission and the vision and the overview of this effort alongside the decision-making process and our 2021 work plan. The sector committees and advisory groups will also play a role in this interim report through providing a report out of their charge and their scope and the objectives, as well as identified opportunities and challenges in the group, possibly noting some areas that need further research or gaps in knowledge that we have. So as I mentioned, this will all be setting the stage for the 2021 work that dives into those emission reduction strategies. And there's no hiding that this is a short timeline, and this requires us to work quickly, and it requires investment by all of our members across the board. So that's the context of our Climate Initiatives Task Force, but now let's dive into what that means for the Equity Advisory Group. Before jumping into the advisory charge, I thought it was important to note, as I've been mentioning, the charge to the committees. their charge is to develop and evaluate emission reduction proposals and create implementation strategies to reach these goals. So that's important to note before jumping into the advisory charge, since these groups, and this group more particularly, will be reviewing those strategies that have been identified to the committees. They'll also be providing information and assistance to the task force and committees to better understand what this subject matter lens is that needs to be considered. So when it comes to the Equity Advisory Group, this is a charge that our team, as the governor's office, has drafted for this group, but I'd like for us to be able to workshop this charge a little bit today. And we thought through this in 4 different components. First, to define equity in the context of Louisiana climate change and emissions reductions for these conversations. And that's something that maybe we could share with the other committees so that they understand what does equity mean and how do we incorporate equity. Another component is anticipating opportunities to increase equity and identify systems that reduce and prevent equity so that they are considered in the design and implementation of greenhouse gas reduction strategies. So ensuring that we are identifying places to further equity and that we minimize those places that reduce or prevent equity that are considered from the very beginning in design of these strategies. Another component could be to advise committees in the task force on how strategies may mitigate or exacerbate inequities. So pointing out pieces of emission reduction strategies that may work towards or against the equity goals, and how do we then edit and revise the strategies to minimize those impacts. And then lastly, I would say another component might be assisting committees in the development and structure of strategies and mechanisms to ensure equitable measures that offer new opportunities for marginalized communities and increase equity in our society. So how do we offer new opportunities? How do we increase equity through these emission reduction strategies? So this is our starting point, and with this I would like to turn it over to our chair, Colette, to lead us into a bit of a discussion on this. Please don't take any of these as the final charge. It's really just meant for a launching point for all of us. So with that, I'll turn it to our chair.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you for the overview and also for these details about what we're getting into here in this committee. And I want to, sort of prompt committee members to offer a few comments here, specifically around equity, given some of the guidelines that we're thinking through that Lindsay has just reviewed. And I wanted to offer 2 thought pieces into the conversation. And I wanted to pull from a paper that I helped to co-write with Dr. Roberto Berrios, but it was grounded by UNO chart under the guide of Pam Jenkins and Tara Lambeth. But in this paper, Equity and Disaster Recovery, Mitigation and Adaptation, there are 2 places where equity is defined. And as we're thinking about how our committee can define equity and really think about equity here, I wanted to just offer this as part of our contemplation. So the first piece I want to offer is Merriam-Webster. When I go high, I go high. So Merriam-Webster. The term equity can be defined as justice according to natural law and something that is equitable, is fairly and equal with all concerned. So that's equity as equality, I suppose. There's another offering here by Russell and Walkbley from 2016. And this says equity is the absence of disparity. The absence of disparity. And then finally, in the document, I'm going to read just a short excerpt from page 10 of this paper. And it says, regions like the South of Louisiana that pride themselves in pro-business attitudes effectively support environmental injustice by not making the people and organizations directly responsible for climate change and coastal erosion liable for the damages they incur on local populations. Equity and mitigation then must be thought of as being directly related to accountability and responsibility on the part of those who drive and benefit exponentially from the root causes of disaster to those who ultimately suffer the effects of disaster. And so these are not the end all be alls. These are just some starting points, some sort of that broad dictionary, it's all equal, down to we're getting to disparities, into what does it mean in climate mitigation. I mean, I think this is going to be part of our work, right? What does equity mean as for this task force? Where are we going here? And I wanted to just open it up to see where folks are. Not because, again, as Lindsay said, we have to be held to anything, but let's just start this process of defining equity for this task force for ourselves and for the public. And so that when we refer to this, we're building on what we've all agreed and understand to be equity. And so if there's anything on top for anyone, I'd ask you just sort of chime in, just say your name, and I'll just look for some hands here. Oh, I see Ashley has something in the chat. Ashley, can I go ahead and call on you to come in, please?
Sure. Was just sharing that at PolicyLink, for us, we define equity as just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, unlocking the promise of the nation by unleashing the promise in us all. So that's the high level frame, and there's lots underneath it, but I just wanted to offer that as one addition.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And I'm wondering if there are other comments or thoughts just on this from folks. Something that your organization or your programs already use that we can bring into the mix. Yes, Dr. Kenneth.
No, I just I'm sure everyone's probably heard this, but the best, what really clarified it for me, one of the best differentiators was really distinguishing between equality and equity. And I love the graphic, right, of like a dad, a mom, and a kid watching a football game where they're each standing level, right? But of course, like the kid can't see it all, and the mom can barely see, and then equity is where, you align those boxes to where they all have the equal view of the playing field. And I just thought it was a very powerful graphic that really clarified it for me, in terms of that understanding.
Mm-hmm. I really heard equality in the end, but different particular and tailored mechanisms to get people to that equality. Thank you, Dr. Kenneth. That's great. Any others? Just comments or just sort of where are you on the question? No pressure. We'll be diving deep into it and defining it and moving it, but just wanted to, yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, and just trying to think about what the work is going forward. There's the challenge, which in some ways is easier, of looking forward and looking at prospective policies and assessing them for what they might do, and looking at how we would treat those. But the harder thing, which I think has to be part of our discussions, is what is the playing field to begin with, so that we're not measuring against something that ought to be, but we're measuring against what is, as we think about what ought to be. And I just want to, I don't think there's no great wisdom in that. I see people trip over that in previous conversations, and I think we can avoid that from the very beginning and help make sure that other committees understand that in thinking about equity, that you have to look in both directions in order to have a thoughtful approach.
Thank you so much for that, Steve. And I think that's right. When you put your and Dr. Kenneth's comments together, yes, let's get everyone to be able to see the field equally, but let's be honest about what the ground really is for folks. I mean, I think this is really getting to the heart of the matter. And Dr. Craig, I see you coming in as well.
Yes, thank you. I just want to add a comment, and I mentioned this to Lindsay when she first contacted me, that I think we need to keep our minds open to approaching equity as something that's not necessarily a scientific-based problem, one that has scientific approaches or solutions. It involves the humanities, it involves the social sciences, and I hope we're thinking in those terms, because so many of the issues that are brought up by discussions of equity aren't really based in science. They're based in human relationships.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Dr. Colton. And I think that helps to move us on to item number 6, which will continue this conversation. And I want to encourage feedback from the committee. And I want to add into the scoping of climate equity, taking into what we've just heard from everyone, some questions that I'm sure we'll face from other committees and advisory groups and even the task force. But as we talk about equity, what does equity look like tangibly? I think just even listening to Dr. Colton's last remarks, wherever it's coming from, right? What does it look like? How does it play out tangibly? What are the different ways that we need to pull it in, make it happen, and then manifest it? Another question: how can we ensure equity throughout the final product? So not just as this sort of add-in or sort of line of equity, but how do we, as Lindsay was describing to us, the process of hearing from advisory groups and advising the task force, how do we ensure equity throughout the document, throughout the final product, throughout the vision of a better Louisiana? Another question, what will we have to acknowledge or change to achieve equity? I think these are going to be some, tough conversations when it comes to some of our communities. What is it that we have to acknowledge? What is it that we have to change? This is often also where I see us get caught up. And sometimes the necessary acknowledgement, the acknowledgement necessary for moving forward, for moving whole communities forward, for moving processes forward. And then finally, what are some questions or elements that must be a part of this work to advance equity? So I think, again, it gets back to just, I really like when Dr. Colton said, it's the humanities, it's human relationships. And I also think there is data. There's hard data. I know there are equity atlases coming out of Policy Link. There have been data down here since 2005, just what's happening with equity and disaster recovery. We're seeing some science. How do we make all of this taste delicious and, into something that we can all enjoy together? I think that means we've got a big piece of work ahead of us because this isn't the easiest topic to bring into big ideas and big visions, but we're up to the challenge. Just look around. We've got the right task force, the right advisory group to do it. So I want to just say a few more things about equity. And I had to say, I attended the first task force meeting, was very excited, excited to see the governor taking climate change, not just seriously, but directly, and making remarks to the task force. We had an excellent presentation on the science. Lindsay went through some of it, but it was really, if you haven't seen the presentation, it was really a great understanding of what these emissions are doing, what carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions are doing. And if there was one critique I could give to the whole first task force meeting, it was just, we didn't really talk about the people. We didn't really talk about the communities. We didn't really talk about the impact. What happens if we don't reduce these emissions? Who's at stake? Who's at risk first? Who will get the worst part of this? Who will be able to recover? Who will be able to get out of the way? These are the things that we're missing from the conversation. And it was a short meeting. We've got a lot more to go. Lindsay just lined out 2 years of work for us, so we'll get there. But one of the things I think will be our charge as an advisory group is to make sure that we're bringing in the human consequences of this reality and to really make clear for those who rely on statistics and numbers and hard sciences, all of the things they need to know about how this will impact communities. And I think we're going to have a lot of courage here because this conversation is going to require us to look in the past. It's going to require us to uncover and acknowledge some things. And it's going to require us to have the fortitude to take what we've got and go forward, to take what we've got and do the best that we can do for this state, to take what we know and understand about equity and make sure it's throughout this process as we have our conversation, but also in the final product. And so I just want to open it back up to see if there are any other comments just on equity, what we're doing, the scope of work that we're tasked to do, any other definitions or things to keep in mind. Just want to take a few more minutes to hear from folks, especially those who haven't spoken, just where you are, even if they're just big questions for you. And Charles, I saw you come off. If you want to comment, please come in.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. As I hear us all talk, one immediate thought that comes to my mind is, and as Lindsay nicely laid out, we recognize that going forward, we've got to put in strategies, approaches, projects that help us really address this need to tackle and honestly and respectfully tackle the issue of climate change in this state. We know, as Lindsay pointed out, we are historically, unfortunately, a state that has a very, very poor socioeconomic condition and status. And so what immediately comes to my mind is the myriad of job opportunities and other opportunities that can come out of this kind of work. We're a state that still, unfortunately, doesn't have any kind of provisions, what I'm gonna call hardwired into our code, that makes certain that as job opportunities roll out, driven by the state and other local authorities, that there is some heavy focus, deliberate, real, respectful focus on, let's make certain that the underserved, as we tend to call them, and any other marginalized, any other descriptions we may want to use, those communities learn about the job opportunities, are ready to take advantage of the job opportunities, are trained to take advantage of the job opportunities. I could go on and on and on. But restoration of our ecosystem is work that will never go away. It will never go away. It's going to be with us forever. You might say it's a silver lining, so to speak. But as that work goes forward, we got to hardwire things that make certain that opportunities are presented to people in a very fair, equitable, and just manner.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Charles. And the opportunities presented in a fair and equitable and just manner. Thank you for that. I see a few folks with raised hands, so let me go to Liz Russell and then Jasmine Brown.
Thanks, Colette. And I really appreciate this conversation. I really appreciate also you bringing us to the reality in the first meeting that we didn't talk as much about people and the impacts to communities, because I think, we have to be very explicit about the ways in which divestment, underinvestment in our communities over decades, generations, and centuries has disproportionately impacted our communities, and means that there are exacerbated impacts to climate change even before we get to an emissions conversation. We have to be explicit that Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities of color, and low-income communities are more likely to live near toxic and industrial facilities that emit pollutants and shorten and impact the quality of life, as well as cause climate changing emissions. Those same communities are more likely to reside in areas where there's more flooding and more risk to sea level rise, and see stranded assets as coastal land loss continues, even with all of our best efforts, meaning that those communities are less able to adapt. Those communities are more likely to receive inadequate infrastructural investment, both to mitigate disasters ahead of storms and prevent the disasters, both acute and chronic, caused by climate change. And then they also experience delayed and insufficient responses after disaster. And so those are only a few of the ways to your point, Colette, tangibly talk about what those impacts are. But I think it's really important to be explicit about who bears the brunt of inaction or if we aren't able to produce actionable pathways to reducing emissions, both in Louisiana and globally, who really deals with the consequences. And then to build on Charles's point, and I'm so grateful to already see jobs and inclusive economies being brought into this, we have to really recognize the ways that economic disparities show up, both in terms of experiencing climate impacts and being able to adapt and being able to live a healthy and vibrant life in the state of Louisiana. And so I just want to underscore that every facet of this task force for me also has to include ways that we reduce those economic disparities across Louisiana communities and center inclusive new ways to build economies that really look at the emerging industries we're trying to support, and whether those are wind and solar, whether those are closing existing abandoned gas wells, whether those are water management and coastal restoration, or on and on and on, that we know communities who are better resourced are more able to adapt and less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So how do we be really explicit that the ways we take action can, and really our governmental and institutional practices and policies can really mitigate and reduce some of those disparities, as opposed to exacerbating them as we respond to climate change in all the ways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that, Liz. And Dr. Robinson Morris, I missed your hand, but let's take Jasmine Brown and then we'll come to you. Apologies. Jasmine, let's hear from you.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And Charles, we have the exact same thought, and I just want to echo your sentiments. You know, one of the greatest opportunities of this particular task force is that we have the opportunity to not just speak about equity and to offer our thoughts, but to actually practice equity in action. And so when I think about one of the greatest expressions of equity in action, the first thing that comes to mind is economic mobility. And I know for certain, just at the forefront of our work, when we think about economic mobility, obviously jobs and opportunities is the direct vehicle to economic mobility. And so as we do, you know, Madam Chairwoman, you mentioned just expressing equity throughout this entire process. And I think really thinking about this also through the lens, not only through the lens of health consequences, but also through the lens of workforce initiatives, workforce training, and workforce opportunities is really a very, has the potential rather to have an amazing impact, because the money and the jobs, as we all know within this space, is there. And as Charles alluded to, it will be there. And so I would just like to continue to offer that as we think about equity within this space, is that we think about it through the lens of implementing workforce initiatives that include intentional outreach and inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Jasmine. Dr. Robinson Morris, you want to come in now? Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to say the comments you offered earlier were spot on around folks having seats at the table. Like, climate equity is a result of climate justice and environmental justice, and folks being included in the decision-making process. It's not simply just economics, right? It is inclusion from beginning to end, right? Nothing about us without us has to be the focus. The other piece that I want to raise about equity is that this word scares me. It's in the title of my own center, right? Because it is one of those things that has become such a buzzword that we've forgotten what the definition really means, and that it changes generationally, and sometimes decade by decade. Equity is a moving target. And we could set some of those measures that were set out are wonderful, but we may find at the end of the year that those aren't enough, right? Because the environment is changing so rapidly. So I want us to keep that in mind as well. And to your definition for equity, right, is for me, it's that no single group suffers disadvantages within environmental hazards, in this context at least, and that we're mindful that it is a moving target, in that we acknowledge that there is an unequal distribution of disadvantages based on a number of factors.
Thank you for that. And I really appreciate it is economics, but it's not just economics, right? This is a broader conversation. Thank you for bringing that in. And Steve, Steve Cochran, I see your hand raised. Please come in.
Thanks. Two things. One is I sort of feel the need to, my impression is that a lot of the groups that, a lot of the other committees that we will be talking to won't have a very clear definition of what equity is or a vague sort of understanding of it. And so I think that puts some clear pressure on us to be clear as we've been talking about here, as we communicate out what we actually mean. And so I think that's just one point. The other is, and this may not be the place to do this. I'm really taken by the contrast between facts and values that Dr. Colton talked about, and within this context in particular, that's generally always interesting. It's particularly interesting here because I remember listening to the Climate Task Force first meeting and listening to some people emphasize very directly that, so this is about facts, right? That kind of thing. And so I want to just raise that. Again, I don't know if this is the place right now to have that conversation, but I think Dr. Colton is right about the values-based aspects of what we're doing here. And I think we'll probably have to define that very clearly on the front end as well. So I just wanted to raise that here, and then we can talk about it when it's appropriate. So.
Yeah, I think that's right, Steve. Thank you for that. And we are going to take the time as a group to define equity so that we can all be clear, because of what Dr. Robinson Morris mentioned, like this buzzword is starting to mean different things for different people, and we want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And so we really are asking you and public comment to give us, the elements of what this has to incorporate, and let's make a decision as a group to go forward and move that. So thank you for those comments, Steve. And thank you everyone for your comments. This is just beginning. We know we have a fast timeline to produce work, but I think this is really a necessary part of our scoping around climate equity. And, in addition to getting to this content and figuring out how to work it through, especially when we see some of these ideas, recommendations, and projects that are moving, we really need to get a clear understanding of our decision-making process. So there's work, there's deep work, there's content work, and then there's a decision-making process that we want to make sure that everyone is clear on. So I want to say thank you for this. We'll have one more moment in just a few minutes. We'll come back around to each of the advisory group members to ask you for your objective and what is an objective that you bring with you into this committee. But before we go there, let me turn it back over to Lindsay to help us just get an understanding of the structured decision-making process, which is item 7 on the agenda. Lindsay?
Thank you, Chair. And members, thank you so much for that wonderful discussion on scoping equity. That's something we'll be working through in this meeting and in the next meeting as we begin to think through what members need from other committees, what members need to understand about equity. And as many of you mentioned, even in how we define equity and how we look at it in this lens will be very important. So we'll talk through that more in next steps. First, I'd like to talk to you all a little bit about our decision-making process. So we've been able to define the deliverables and the timeline that we're working on, but it's important also to consider how will we get there. And so we'll be using a structured decision-making process ultimately to develop the climate strategy to achieve those emission reduction targets. So structured decision-making, known as SDM, is not just a process to say that we have a process, but it really helps us to move forward in an objective, a transparent, and a structured manner. So SDM provides the transparency and the structure to first articulate all of our objectives, including those that target greenhouse gas emission reduction, as well as our economic and societal objectives. It also, to Steve's point that he just made, this process also puts the core values and objectives, including those in and beyond reducing carbon emissions of the task force, the committees, and the advisory groups. It puts them transparently on the table at the start of the effort. And then it gives structure to ensure that we consider those values in how strategies are crafted and how they're evaluated, selected, and implemented. And so this is why in these initial conversations of all the groups, we're focusing on setting our objectives, because it's critical at the beginning we are clear on how the process considers equity and considers those core values from the beginning. I'll also note here that another benefit of SDM that's critical in our conversation, that it serves as the convergence of science and policy, which is helpful for us because we're addressing, as we've been speaking about, the executive order and the policy and legal strategies to reduce emissions. But this must also be well informed by the science and the data of what our emissions look like. So this process helps us look at both of those components together. So I'll quickly define the 6 steps in the decision-making process that we will be following. Today we'll start with steps 1 and 2, the decision context, and then defining our objectives. And then we'll also move into later steps in the new year, including, as I mentioned, that public solicitation of emission reduction solutions, and then the evaluation that advisory groups will be a part of, the trade-off analysis that will pool all of the emission reduction strategies, and then that final decision we'll take through the climate strategy next February. And so the key benefit I see here is that we can have structured conversations about complex decisions. And as all of you know, and as our chair mentioned many times, these are hard conversations to have, and they're complicated things to even define, much less incorporate into the decision-making process. But we really want to focus on breaking down these complex problems and having conversations that are focused on values, not just facts. So as the Equity Advisory Group, you will play a primary role in step 4. Of course, in each step, the group will be integrated, but I see particularly this furthers that charge that we set forth in the beginning of evaluating emission reduction strategies from the sector committee. And in the coming meetings, we, as an advisory group, will be working towards what are our metrics and what's our framework by which we will evaluate these emission reduction strategies. And that will be built out from the objectives that we lay forth today and in the coming weeks. And so the charge of the committees and advisory groups build on one another. If we have committees identifying emission reduction strategies, then we need someone to evaluate them, and we need those advisory groups to play the evaluatory role. And this will all be done in a public and transparent process through the criteria, which is important that we start from the beginning of this process in a public manner and in a transparent manner, that we lay out what the full scope of the problem is, that we have these hard conversations, that we lay out all of our objectives, what we're bringing to the table transparently, so that as we get into the process of identifying and evaluating solutions, that can also be done in a public manner. So all of that to say that today we'll start with these first 2 steps. And we've already begun to talk through the problem, but I'll note again that we need to have a common understanding of why we're here. So simply put, climate change is driving up global temperatures, raising sea levels, increasing risks that threaten our health, our safety, our quality of life, our economic growth, our vital habitats, and this has disproportionate impacts on residents of our state with the fewest resources. So as I mentioned, this process is the convergence of science and policy. So that policy context is very important, but must also be complemented by the scientific overview of emissions, which is also the basis of the problem we're solving. So as a reminder, our most recent state inventory was made in 2010 utilizing 2005 data, and that's what we're looking at here. This is a very broad overview of the inventory, but I think important to note for our equity group to understand the data that the state has on this side. So a few things to note here. Carbon dioxide from fossil fuel emissions accounts for 84% of our emissions. And this is why we focus on CO2 reductions, on those carbon dioxide emissions. But we also have other greenhouse gases that we're investigating, including nitrous oxide, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, and others that are noted in that first column on greenhouse gases. And it's helpful to see that in Louisiana, we're pretty unique in the fact that most of our fossil fuel combustion is rooted in industry. So I've pulled out on the right side a pie chart that shows that 84%, what is inside of the 84% fossil fuel combustion. And this is primarily industry, again, unique to Louisiana, followed by transportation, electric power, and then buildings. So now that we have defined the decision context, now we can move into step 2, which is defining our objectives. And so the decision context that we just talked about and that we had spoken to on scoping equity should influence how we define the objectives of this group. So what do we really care about and how do we get there? And this is a vital step, as I mentioned, to define our objectives transparently so that we can guide our evaluation later in the process based on what really does matter to us. So the primary goal of this effort is emission reductions, but there are other objectives that will and should influence how we decide to reduce emissions. As the governor even mentioned in his executive order, this is a balance of reducing emissions while limiting the impact of climate change and while maintaining our position as a leader. And so reducing emissions can't be done without considering the cost, the profitability, the societal benefits, and the equitable values and outcomes. So this is why we've brought together a very broad group of you, all of our experts on this advisory group, to ensure that many aspects of equity are considered and that they remain fundamental to the effort, and that they are values laid out from the beginning of the discussion. And as you can note at the bottom of this slide, there will also be means objectives that we define. How will we get there? How will we reach these fundamental objectives? But first, we'll start by defining those guidelines of what we care about that are fundamental to this effort. So with all of that said, I will open us up to a discussion of our objectives. And this is our first big step as a group to be able to define our goals without going directly to emission reduction solutions and strategies. And it provides the opportunity to show where our experience and our expertise influences how we make decisions, and so that we can voice those from the beginning of the process and have that as part of the consideration as we move forward. And this allows us to put everything on the table and then have the next 14 months to think through how do we get there and what are the means by which we can reach those goals. And as I mentioned, this will be clear on how we define equity in the process. And so with that, I will take a few notes as we discuss on the slides, and this will just be a few brief notes from what members mentioned so that we can build on the objectives of others and coordinate in the objectives we're reaching. But I'll note with that, we have Supi Daliander from the Water Institute of the Gulf, who is our SDM expert, who will be taking some notes. And if you guys have any questions for her on process as well or on the objectives piece, I know she'd be happy to help think through that. And the notes that she takes will be far more in-depth than the ones I take on the slides. So if what you mention is not written, then they will still be incorporated into the objectives as we continue to develop and refine them after this discussion. So with that, I will ask our chair to kick us off. And Colette, I'd like to ask you that in your work as an Obama Fellow and in your current work leading the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, what do you see as fundamental to this effort?
Thank you, Lindsay. I've been thinking about this, and I think my biggest objective on this task force will be to ensure that the final product of the task force honestly acknowledges the root cause of the climate crisis and the connection of those root causes to social injustice and environmental stewardship. And these are critical to achieving climate equity. A real honesty, a real acknowledgement, a starting point, right? I know we'll have different levels of what we solve and solutions that we actually build, but I think at some point we have to start telling the truth. And I'm hoping that this is really going to be a starting point for that. What are the real root causes? What are we actually fighting? What is the long-term work really need to be targeted and focused on? Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, I'd like to call on a few of our members and then open up the floor. Steve, with your expertise in MRD, leading and managing that group, and also with the Environmental Defense Fund over the past few decades, all of the different roles that you have played in that organization, I'm curious what you believe is fundamental to this effort and to the considerations that we have in equity.
I think Colette is right, so I'll start there. And that's what she just said is the easiest thing to say and the hardest thing to actually do, because lots of people are going to have different views about what the root causes are. And then even if we might agree on what they are, there will be people nervous about saying those things out loud. So we should just acknowledge that among ourselves, and that's okay. That those are humans, but we should work together, understanding that will be a challenge that we don't need to get stuck on, and we could. So we need to try to avoid doing that. Second, I do have a practical question on the previous slide where objectives were listed. And I haven't seen these before, so that's my limitation. But the first one, which talked about at a minimum not making things worse, sort of. I have to go back and look at the language. That worries me because it sets a pretty low bar to meet. And there is a tendency, particularly in large group discussions, for the lowest common denominator to win out. And since some of these conversations are going to be difficult, I want to be careful about the language of what our objective is. So I don't know if that's discussable at this point, or if this is our task, and so we have to figure out how to make it work. So, but I just don't know. So I wanted to ask that practical question.
No, thank you for asking that, Steve. These were just examples that we had drafted of what could be objectives of the group, more so to frame how we should be thinking about this. We'd like to create objectives that maximize or minimize and increase or decrease certain factors so that we have action. So these just frame a few options of what that could look like. And I apologize for not going through that.
That's great. I wanted to make sure. So the last thing I would say is that we will get into the substance. I think it is, and I think this is what we're intended to do, but I think it's absolutely essential to, as early as humanly possible, to communicate with the other committees so that they know how we're going to be evaluating the policies from an equity perspective, because it's most essential for people to know what the questions on the test are going to be, so that we can actually be talking about the same thing, rather than we get a set of policy recommendations and we have to go, this is not even close to what we ought to do from an equity perspective. We would like to avoid that as much as possible. That requires really engaging in that conversation very early. And if there's going to be pushback from a committee, that we have that conversation up front rather than at the back end of this process. So I just think that's a really nothing other than a structural focus, but something that we really ought to take seriously so that we have our best chance of being successful. I will add one other thing. I think our ability to be effective at achieving the things that we will try to, diminishes as we get closer to the end. And so I think we ought to take advantage of our opportunity and drive our messages and our criteria as early as possible so that we have the time to work through whatever differences occur in the process, not end up at a collision at the end, which ultimately won't achieve likely what we want or anyway. So that's the other piece I would really focus on.
And Steve, with your second point on ensuring communication with committees, this is something we'll discuss in next steps, and I think very important to note that the Equity Advisory Group is not just a responding group to evaluating strategies that have already been developed. We will play a key role on the front end to provide for committees what, as we spoke to earlier, what is equity and what does that mean in the context of this work? What are our expectations as well? So I'm excited that you members also see that as an issue and want to lay that forth from the beginning. I noticed that Chief Sherrill had raised her hand, and then also after that, Craig Colton and then Ashley Gardier.
Yes,
Chief
thank
Sherrill.
you. Thank you very much. Okay, so in regards to my view on the fundamental objectives, you know, Louisiana is extremely diverse. It's beautiful, right? Diversity is our identity. That diversity should be celebrated and protected. What has surrounded the majority of my work as an Indigenous person and someone who is considered living on the front lines of the impacts of climate change in my own community, we really try to ensure that in everything that is being done, that there is a respect and an honor for traditional life ways and TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, which has been proven successful when coupled with science. In short, like, our success should not be rooted in oppression of a people or a community, right? We should not be doing anything that would bring further harm to those who have already experienced so much harm. We have been in a survival mode in our adaptation practices, and what we need to be doing is actually be focusing on thriving and setting precedents, you know, so that positive progress can be implemented in other areas all across the globe.
Those are wonderful comments to ensure. And members, as I write notes on the screen, please let me know how we can workshop these words as well. And with that, I'll move to Dr. Colton.
As I look through this list of the sector committees, I suspect a lot of the representatives won't have deep and historical activities that relate to equity issues. And I think just as a real basic things that kind of builds on what Steve was talking about is we need to put forward to them that every decision they'll be making, every recommendation they make has some kind of equity component, that it plays in every single decision, every single action this task force undertakes. So, and we can perhaps just develop a quick little inventory of things that might resonate with each of these different sector committees that help them recognize that things like jobs, some of the things we've already talked about today, really matter in every one of their sectors. And it's not just jobs, but it's who ends up with the clunker automobiles when we move to more fuel efficient cars. when you look what happened in the 80s when we went from big cars to smaller cars, the people who could least afford it got the big gas guzzlers as third or fourth generation owners. So there are things that matter at every stage of the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Colton. Lindsay, I'm just going to help out here. I see you doing notes and stacks, so I'll go ahead and just help folks on the line here. I see we have Ashley Gardier up, and then we'll go to Dr. Robinson Morris.
So first I want to just ask that y'all bear with me because I'm trying to blend a previous comment and then this piece about objectives. One is that part of what I'm holding is that our always objective is trying to get to an anti-racist government and anti-racist economy. And so that's the lens that I'm bringing into these comments. What I actually see as an opportunity both for the task force and this advisory group specifically is an opportunity for us to really introduce new practices that are both related to equitable outcomes and equitable processes along the way. So to the earlier points raised, I think that we need to be providing a framework to all the committees that offers not only a shared definition around equity, but also shared values and some of the shared practices that we want to see each of the committees kind of using to as they create their work and recommendations. With that lens around anti-racist government and anti-racist economy, I think that means a practice about centering race, right? So when we are evaluating emissions reduction alternatives and consequences that we are making that evaluation by race and also in this context by geography. I think all of that is included in this notion of equity. I think we also have the opportunity to data-driven decision-making and the disaggregation of race by centering those who are most impacted. So in the examples that were offered previously, I think that's about how we prioritize Black and Indigenous communities in accessing economic opportunities, or likewise that we're prioritizing mitigation strategies in the most impacted communities based on the data. So that's all about the opportunity related to equitable outcomes. And then I want to go back to something that Dr. Robinson Morris mentioned a while ago. I also think it means that we've got to center people, like the real people. And so when we think about disproportionate impacts, I really want to test with this group whether or not we can be creative about how we include the voices of Louisiana people as we think about those disproportionate consequences. And I think that opens up for us the opportunity related to equitable process. So those are the pieces that I'm holding, but all of that with an eye towards really leveraging the state's leadership to model what this emissions reduction work could mean inside of racial and economic equity, both in process and in result.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Ashley. I'm really hearing the acknowledgement of race and centering people, but also hearing the opportunity here to make new practices, to make new things, to move. You know, we don't always just have to try to recreate what was or the understanding of what we thought, but be courageous and innovative to create new ways of being for the leadership. That was excellent for a broader leadership. Thank you. Let me go to Dr. Robinson Morris. Come on in on this one. Yeah.
Well, Ashley said exactly what I was going to say, but just better. I want to lift up the point of the practice, the equitable practice, right? So in each phase of this process, going back to the community to ask them if this reflects their experience is going to be extremely key, right? It's what we do in equitable research practices. The other piece, again, goes back to centering people, exactly what Ashley said, that most of my research, of course, I'm an educational philosopher. I don't do the environmental stuff full time, but all of my research centers one question, right? What does it mean to be a human being within a specific context? And so how do we, within this discussion around equity, how do we minimize suffering? How do we move from simple survival or existence into human flourishing? right? And other than human flourishing, right? And those other aspects of our ecosystem that are impacted by climate change.
Mm-hmm.
The other point that you raised at the very beginning, Madam Chair, was about telling the truth and telling the unvarnished truth. And we can tell so many facts, as Maya Angelou would say, that we never get to the truth. And so it's going to be really important to go back to the truth every time, because the facts can obscure the truth, and we know they have historically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I really hear the practice piece here, right? We're not just going for those goals and those check boxes. We're actually trying to build a practice and a way of doing things. Equity is not just something to achieve; it's something to manage, work at, grow, and like democracy. These things, it's not just one day where you press a button. You've got to manage it. You've got to push it along. Thank you so much. Let's go to Jasmine, and then Liz, and then Charles.
So I just wanted to memorialize a little bit of the conversation that we had earlier about jobs. I know we've already talked at length about it, but I think that it's important to also include it here expressly as we think through our fundamental objectives. So if we could list that, maybe implementing and promoting workforce initiatives or prioritizing workforce initiatives that include intentional outreach and inclusion for people of color.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm hearing I didn't hear like green jobs. I heard like, as we sort of move in this broader workforce, I heard a broader stance there, Jasmine.
Absolutely. Throughout all initiatives and throughout everything that we will be evaluating, I just would hope that we could keep that economic mobility through the lens of job opportunities and job preparation and training at the forefront of what we're thinking about.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And I think we heard some comments. I think Charles earlier, these jobs many of them are here. Many of them will be here. Lots more are coming. What is the equity lens for the people of this place? What is the equity lens, as Chief Parfait Dardar mentioned, that is honorable? Where does honor fit into some of this stuff? I mean, these are important pieces. And I think that jobs piece is it's so concrete and so clear. How do we get some of these other pieces in as well? Thank you so much for that, Jasmine. I believe that was captured on the screen. Let's go to Liz and then Charles.
Yeah, thank you so much, Madam Chair. There's so much of what has been said that I'm going to try to lace in together a little bit. I'm just so grateful and honored to be a part of this conversation with all of you. I feel like there's so much that we need to do to center people and communities and humanity and be working towards anti-racism racist government and economies at all levels. Ashley, thank you, Ms. Gardia, for being so explicit. I also want to ensure that we do what we can to find ways to ensure that those measures and metrics are built into the requirements for every single committee on the task force. I want to be sure that there are, and to Professor Colton, just to be transparent, what are the ways that we can use the social sciences, or Dr. Robinson Morris, what you've mentioned in terms of those different ways of facts distorting as opposed to being truthful? How do we explicitly build in measures to prevent harmful and toxic recommendations from moving forward as actionable, because we don't see some unintended consequence towards especially Black communities or Indigenous communities and how they might play out over time? And so, Steve Cochran, I appreciate your comment at the start that at the base level is to not do more harm. And I think that's true. And I want to make sure that that is built into every single committee. And, it is any recommendation that any committee makes is sort of prevented from moving forward without demonstrating that it doesn't create worse impacts. And also, how are those impacts improved? How do we see reductions that really center the anti-racism work in how those recommendations would be implemented. How do we dismantle those inequities? How do we build that into the economic opportunity, to Jasmine Brown's point, at every level, and the job opportunities created, whether those are through existing economic development practices, or whether, to your point earlier, Madam Chair, we have to create entirely new models. And so to be very explicit, I want to make sure that what we're talking about is also translated into measures that go across every single committee. So to build on your point, Steve, of course, we need to be talking to people from the outset, and also all recommendations that come from those committees need to be measured against whether they have unequal or unequitable, and we're very explicit about how that works, impacts to our communities across Louisiana. And that actually prevents moving forward until those inequitable tactics are mitigated, right? That recommendation can't be moved forward as actionable unless it is mitigated for those consequences. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I hear lots of things there, Liz. Thank you. And I hear, we've got to be honest about this cost benefit analysis, because what we're going to be up against, as we acknowledge, Liz, what you're just saying is, harm will be defined based on a cost benefit analysis, right? So if, and so who gets sacrificed? And I think we get back to Chief Parfait Dardar's point, it cannot be oppressive projects that we're advancing or theories that we're advancing. They cannot be rooted in oppression of any people, of anybody, which I think is a good starting point. I also heard something, Liz, about defining harm, because there is a broad global conversation around the burden of proof, right? So putting the burden of proof on the opposite side, right? So it shouldn't be on the community to prove that we are being harmed, but rather on the project developer, the industry, whatever, to prove that it will not cause harm. And so I just wanted to really kind of lift that up out of that harm definition as well. Charles, we've got you next. You want to come in? Yeah, come on in.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. As I hear all of us talk here, and they're all wonderful comments, they really resonate with me. I'm channeling a dear friend and colleague of mine who has now moved on to an even bigger title at another organization nationally and internationally around, how do we tackle equity and all these high, far-reaching goals that we need to tackle. And I remember asking her one time, what do you think we need to communicate most to folks right now? And she said, well, Charles, something that's just lost on us these days, especially as it relates to our body politic and other bodies of work, we're not empathetic enough. We don't take the time to see ourselves in one another. We're in such a hurry to compete against one another and to get the project done and to do this and do that. And nobody's taking the time anymore to get to know one another, but to the point of let's see ourselves in one another's experiences to help us move to a point of understanding where we're all coming from. And that also, of course, speaks to that point of being respectful and being fair and just, but then also being loving, And I don't have a problem saying that, and I hope you all are not in any way taken aback from this. I just feel like there's a lot of focus on, and there should be, focus on centering people, the warmth of all this work. And I just feel like, to channel my friend, that empathy and empathetic feeling is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Oh, go ahead.
A wonderful point to make. And I'm curious how we can translate that into an objective of this group. How do you think we can apply that and make that fundamental in the effort?
Dr. David Morrison pointed out earlier about how, as we do this work, we should take the time, and I think I heard him correctly. If I'm misspeaking here, please let me know. Of going back to people, the people that we say we serve, and asking them, how does this look? Does this feel right? Does this achieve it? You know, it kind of causes you to always, you might say, second guess what you're doing, or let's make certain we verify this. Let's check this. Let's check this based on and be basically guided by feedback from people out there in this global community of ours that we say we serve. I think we should always just, if we can, I realize we got an ambitious timeline and agenda ahead of us, but I feel like we gotta every now and then, let's check this, let's verify it, let's gauge this. Let's not just go on it because we think it's so damn great, you know, but we gotta verify.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really heard that, I think, in some of Ashley's remarks and Dr. Robinson Morris's remarks, how we engage the public, what that looks like, really even rethinking that in this process and broader processes. So yeah, thank you for that, Charles. And empathy, seeing ourselves in each other, that's real. Steve, we see you on Stack, and we've got just a minute left. We'll let you close us out on this section, and then we'll move into our next section.
It'll be quick. I love the idea of modeling equity, modeling the behavior that we want to see. I think we absolutely have to do that relative to communities and the public. I want to encourage us also that we have to remember to do that with our relative committees that we're going to be talking with as well, and make sure that we extend to them the same respect that we want to have for the work that we're trying to do, and do our best to hold to that as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Steve. And Dr. Kenneth, I noticed that I hadn't asked you to throw in your objective here. I don't know, no pressure, but I wanted to just see if you have an objective, especially from that health perspective, that we could capture into these.
So the only thing I would add is to ensure to include a countervailing perspective. And what prompts me to say that is I'll never forget, I gave a talk one time where my CEO was present, and I just outlined some things that I thought were givens in terms of what healthcare should be. It should be safe, timely, efficient, effective, equitable, and patient-centered. And the CEO of a health system, basically says, yeah, I agree, that sounds great, everything except the equitable part. I mean, I don't know that there's any need to consider that. And I can look at it and say, my gosh, I mean, that's crazy. Like, what is he thinking? Except that, the next CEO who came after him even thought less of equity than that CEO. And to the point where, like, I remember giving an interview where I was talking about climate change and the prevalence of, things like, it's a reality that something like dengue, an infectious disease in the tropics, could make its way, into the mainland, and we could start seeing, the emergence of microbes that cause pretty serious infection, much like what we've seen with this pandemic. And then that same CEO basically kind of just scoffed at that idea, thinking that was ridiculous, and that I was just, this liberal that basically then diminishes sort of my standing, in that CEO's eyes. And so, what it taught me was that, look, the deal was there was no way I was going to ever make any progress in what I was trying to do, unless I had, some agreement with that CEO about what we were trying to accomplish. And so making sure that from the radical inclusion, diversity, equality, equity perspective, we need to hear from the people who don't believe in this stuff, and including in this forum, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm gonna have my sip of tea with that one, because I hear and feel the truth of it. And I think it's a reminder of our diverse state. We've got a lot of folks, as Chief mentioned, we've got a lot of folks, a lot of different communities. Our diversity is our strength. And it will make the work of this advisory group stronger if we're inclusive and aware. Where do we need to strengthen our arguments? Where do we need to strengthen our own processes so that everybody can see the value? So thank you for that real talk from the doctor. Appreciate you. Well, thank y'all. We wanted to set some objectives. We will have time, but not that much time to really clarify them, streamline them, clean them up, move them. We will also be reaching out to a couple of members who weren't able to join us today, just to make sure that we've got everyone's input on this. We're also looking forward to hearing from the public on what some of their hopes and thoughts for objectives are for this group. And so we'll have some time at the end of this meeting to just read some of the public comments into the record, but we'll be, open to hearing from folks on that. Let me move us then to item number 9, which is really just a discussion of next steps. As we go into the next steps, I just want to say this has really been a helpful discussion, right? A real, broad and helpful discussion. And I think it's really a sign of where we're going to go in this advisory group. And so I'm just really grateful to all of you agreeing to take this journey. And let's get clear on what some next steps are and how we keep this moving. Lindsay, let me turn it over to you for some next steps.
Thank you, Chair. So members, I appreciate the robust conversation that we were able to have on objectives. And I would encourage you, I'll note this on the next slide as well, but please continue as you think throughout this week on objectives. Email me or our climate email to provide any additional fundamental objectives that you might consider as the week goes on. And also, as Colette mentioned, we will incorporate the objectives of those that are mentioned in the public and also in for those members that are not present today. And so our goal with the objectives that are being developed across all of the different groups is that in the next task force meeting, we'll bring these draft objectives, and again, further distill them then on the prior slide, but bring these draft objectives and a draft of our advisory group charge to the task force alongside all of the other groups and have a discussion on how we can coordinate our objectives, on how our charges can complement one another, how we can make these effective and coordinating discussions happen from the very beginning of this effort, even as we consider our objectives. And so this will really ensure that from the beginning of the process, we're coordinated. As you can note on this timeline to the interim report, we also have one more meeting to be held in January before we come up with this interim report. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to dive further into this discussion on scoping equity in the context of this conversation. And as many of you have talked about today, what information is it necessary for us to provide to committees before they move into the proposal process and start to consider emission reduction strategies? What do they need to know about equity more broadly, and then about this group in its evaluation and its scoping of equity as well? So those components, I believe, will be necessary to discuss in the next meeting. So as I mentioned, please do send your draft objectives to me. I'll also be sharing with members a Google Drive where you can identify and share resources on possibly resources where you think equity has been defined well, where you think the components of equity have been outlined in a manner that might be easily understood for members of the committees that aren't as familiar. As we've also spoken to, possibly providing some data and evidence of why this needs to be a priority in the subject matter lens. So I would really appreciate if all of you over the next week or two, hopefully before Christmas even, begin to put those resources together and share them in the Google Drive. This will not be a place where we edit and revise documents, but more so just a place where we can put them and prepare for our discussion in the next meeting. And it would also, the chair and I would also appreciate if you all were able to think of some ideas and maybe have some draft deliverables of what this might need to look like. And lastly, in next steps, a lot of you come from wonderful research institutions or have great bodies of work behind you, and we want to ensure that from the beginning of this effort, we're identifying any gaps in knowledge that might exist, maybe things that we haven't quite identified yet or you think need to be further refined or studied before we move forward in the process. So also providing identification of those gaps in the beginning as well. And with that, I would like to ask our chair if she has any additional next steps that she would like to offer.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate the resources piece. I think we're all bringing in really strong work and perspectives into this. And so I just want to reiterate that space where we can share resources with each other, learn and grow together. And I also just want to bring back the point that was made several times about process. We are open, both Lindsay and I, to, this is a very interesting moment we're in with our virtual meetings and our pandemic and such. We're trying to do the best we can, but we really want to take those comments about engagement in a real way. And so if there's tactics or strategies that you've used before, we're really trying to figure a few things out on our end. So please feel free to share ways that you've seen processes be really inclusive, and we'll bring that back and see how we can move with the times and move with the reality of things. So that's my only addition into next steps. If you can share what you have.
Wonderful. Before we move into public comment, I would just like to note that we are holding meetings across all 10 of the committees and advisory groups. Starting last week, we had a few of the committees, and then this week as well. And next week, we'll hold the final few committee meetings. So please go on our webpage noted right here, and you'll be able to view the YouTube live streams and the archive of all meetings that have happened up to this date if you missed them, and stay up to date with the ones that will be coming in the next few weeks. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our public comment period. I'll note here that if the chair agrees, possibly we could take a few-minute break right now. I know we're butting up against the end of our time here, but take a few-minute break so that the public has time to submit those comments that they might be drafting in email form right now. And just to reiterate what our chair mentioned earlier, please submit your comments to climate@la.gov. And in the subject line, include reference to the advisory group, the equity advisory group, and include your name and address in the body of your message. And we'll read those in just a few minutes. Chair, possibly we could take a 3-minute break right now.
Okay, that sounds great. We just want to ensure that the public comments come in. So we're just going to take just a couple minutes. If you want to grab a little water, a little cup of coffee, we'll take just a few minutes break here. All right, we're right at the hour, just a few minutes to allow for public comment to come in. I want to just hand it back over to Lindsay for public comment to be read into the record.
Thank you, Chair. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Charles Sutcliffe, in the governor's office as well, and he'll be reading the public comments into the record directly from the email.
Hi, everybody. We do have 3 so far, and we'll see if we have a few more by the time we get done reading through these. So I just wanted to start off with this one from Andy Kowalczak. He is the MISO South Grass Tops campaign coordinator. The following comments addressed to the objectives of the Equity Advisory Group, along with more in-depth comments that elaborate on the following points. It's critical in striving towards equity in this process that we engage in making sure the needs of workers are met and that these needs are made visible. So how do we make workers visible? We establish a means to understand the impact on workers of economic transitions. There are indeed economic transitions underway in many states across the country, whether they are imposed, like the COVID-19 pandemic, or those that are proactive in nature, like the energy transition. The recent support for clean energy jobs and proposals to address the economic recovery from the pandemic further lends credibility to the importance and potential of jobs in these sectors. The same cannot be said for trends in incumbent energy industries and fossil fuels. To forecast the future of work in certain industry sectors is essential, and to guarantee that workforce development and economic assistance is available at scale to workers is critical. In addition, to prioritize economic development that is rooted in industry sector diversity is important in ensuring that risk is not too heavily allocated to one manufacturing facility or plant like a refinery. For the purpose of transparency, feedback, and stakeholder engagement, community meetings should be held in communities where needs are greatest. These meetings should be frequent, well-publicized, and provide for extensive input from community members. With regards to communities, the same structures and concerns should be extended to coastal communities facing impacts due to restoration efforts that seek to limit the effects of erosion and sea level rise in the state. In that context, a just transition for workers is a necessity. The recently announced closure of the Shell refinery in Convent, Louisiana was preceded by the recent closure of the Marathon refinery in Martinez, California, which employed 740 workers and 2,500 contractors. Representative Marc Desaulniers spoke of this closure in his district as needing a transition that is successful as possible for everyone and that we cannot leave workers behind. They need to be guaranteed meaningful and comparable work. The state of Colorado is addressing this need for a transition for coal workers in the state by establishing through state legislation, HB 19-1314, an Office of Just Transition. Decarbonization efforts should establish an office that develops a comprehensive overview of an economic transition, as well as long-range comprehensive policy goals to attain an equitable transition. Decarbonization and renewable energy goals often seek to attain a percentage of energy or emissions. We should also strive to attain goals that workers are visible throughout the process of reaching net zero emissions economy-wide throughout the state. By understanding the needs of workers, we can build prosperity for many, we can build healthy communities, and we can have a sustainable economy. We can equip workers, not just for the future, but with a future. The next one is from Scott Eustace with Healthy Gulf. Louisiana Economic Development must undertake an environmental justice analysis of the sites it advertises as pre-certified for industrial development. These sites are slated to be the origin of the highest carbon emissions per capita in the United States and perhaps the world. The emissions from these sites will far exceed the emissions savings from an electric Louisiana fleet or an industrial carbon sequestration. The emissions from the Formosa Plastics proposal alone will exceed the emissions of every automobile in the state of Louisiana by several times. We call upon LDEQ to deny that permit until the impacts to health, small businesses, and our coastal wetlands via aggravated sea level rise have been assessed. And there's an attachment that goes along with that we can make available. Formosa Plastics and other companies have identified Louisiana Economic Development as the source of the environmental racism in their site selection process. Often these sites are in African American towns and will affect Black Louisianians disproportionately with cancer risks to young and old, including unborn children. These Block groups are suffering the largest cancer risk in the nation and the highest rates of death from cancer in the nation. These Louisianians are also disproportionately killed by the COVID-19 pandemic due to poor lung health. There's another attachment that I will include as well. These risks and health impacts are intimately connected with the fact that local business growth has declined in the river parishes where petrochemical development has occurred, according to the U.S. Small Business Administration. Residents in the river parishes need their lung health to create and run small businesses. Black and Indigenous Louisianians have suffered due to the erasure of their cultural sites, cemeteries, and grave sites during the eras of colonization and the Jim Crow era. Louisiana economic development must fund geological and historic investigations before advertising sites as ready for construction. Louisianians deserve an economy that serves them instead of one that hires Texans for the profit of Saudi Arabia. Louisiana economic development must release any meeting minutes, including contact information and email correspondence, regarding development of any pre-certified sites and environmental justice block groups. These deals being made with state money on our behalf are determining the future of the Earth's climate. And then I have one from Jane Patton, and Jane is the director of No Waste Louisiana. As a sixth-generation Louisianian with roots in Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and Lafayette, I am commenting today on behalf of myself, my family, and my ancestors, but also on behalf of the people and ancestors long harmed and extracted from by the state policies, laws, and practices which have themselves led to our current climate crisis. The Black and Indigenous communities and ancestors in particular have had land, life, and safety removed from them over time by industries like agriculture, oil, gas, and petrochemicals, all to the benefit of white people. We now find ourselves in a position where those white people are by and large charged with making decisions to address the crisis that we have ourselves created without nearly enough input from affected communities. As this equity group considers its objectives and its role in this much larger conversation about initiatives and responses to the climate crisis, I expect us to uphold and include the following principles in those objectives. That the root cause of the climate crisis actually be acknowledged in this process, that we say it has been unregulated capitalist extraction rooted in violent racism that has created this crisis and that has harmed people, and even that a truth and reconciliation type process is held. That considerations of equity and even repair be present across all subcommittees and advisory committees of the Climate Initiatives Task Force. That as the policy solutions recommended by this task force are enacted by the governor's office and the legislature, communities have self-determination for decisions that will affect their livelihoods and lives. Nearby communities should have decision-making input into whether, for instance, a factory gets built or how a piece of land is used in any climate mitigation efforts. These processes should be about empowering communities, not just engaging them, and should be pivotal in implementing climate change mitigation efforts. That those most deeply affected by the changing climate, people being forced out of land that has previously been safe, people losing their health or food security because of exposure to toxic chemicals or rising temperatures, communities being rent apart by the changing landscape and weather are the first included in remedy efforts, and that they receive all needed resources in creating new lives for themselves and their families. This list is by no means exhaustive, but considerations of equity should be everywhere in this process. Thank you, Jane. And then I have another one from Elizabeth Maxwell, who I believe she's just a citizen. As a 10th and 7th generation New Orleanian, paternal, matriarchal, and patriarchal lines, respectively, I am deeply concerned about the ability for upcoming generations to live and thrive on the land that we call Louisiana. In the Climate Initiatives Task Force examination of applying equity to your upcoming recommendations, I implore you to consider the development of a community-governed reparations fund endowed by ending tax subsidies to fossil fuel corporations and other polluting industries. Per Together Louisiana's extensive research, and there's a link, Louisiana's unique industrial tax exemption program, ITEP, gives away $1.6 billion, yes billion, annually, yes annually, in tax revenue to fossil fuel corporations. Beyond the outrageous inequity of monies already lost to the people of Louisiana, these incentive programs in the name of attracting industry have long outlived their usefulness in the 21st century. The truth of the matter is that oil, gas, and other polluting industries across the state have already vastly invested in Louisiana, and they are beholden to us, desperate to extract the last few remaining natural resources, continuing to utilize their existing infrastructure and pursue an endless growth model despite industry facing inevitable decline. I believe the Climate Initiatives Task Force should recommend and enforce 100% revisitation of the ITEP subsidies in light of current climate conditions, and allocate a significant portion of new tax dollars directly toward an equity-centered, community-governed fund for climate reparations, community-owned renewable energy, and other self-determination projects aimed at healing Louisiana's land and people. $1.6 billion per year could begin to address the damage that has been done to generations of families living in Cancer Alley, to the communities across the state who live amidst constant flooding, and of course to the extensive damage to our wetlands and rich ecology. While not all can be fixed through money, money is a great place to start. It is critical that a reparations fund be community governed in order to maintain legitimacy and accountability to the people of Louisiana. For a primer on community investment funds, including legal structures and actionable steps, see, and there's a link that I can make available. While all 10 models in the report have strengths that the Louisiana Climate Reparations Fund could draw from, it is worth drawing special attention to the democratically governed Boston Ujima Fund as a model. I personally know many of the thinkers and doers behind these projects, and I'm sure that they would be happy to support Louisiana in pioneering a new fund based on climate equity and justice. I believe wholeheartedly that we need solutions on scale with the crisis. The Climate Reparations Fund has never been done before, despite the whole world urgently grappling with the magnitude of the problem and necessary solutions. Louisiana has the opportunity to be a global leader in demonstrating how a former fossil fuel state can structure a just transition to a post-carbon economy that is centered on equity. I hope you will take these ideas under consideration. And I do have one more, I believe. This is from Nick Dixon of New Orleans regarding advisory group composition. Labor leaders are notably missing, e.g. A.C. Cooper of Louisiana Shrimpers Association. Trade unions need to be at the table. Too many big green environmental groups and foundation money is at the table. Also need community-based organizations that are small donor or volunteer-based. On defining equity, there is inequality and inequity. I agree with the notion that we need to understand where these problems come from, then you can solve it. I think it's a distribution problem of wealth and resources. So then solving equity and equality becomes how do we redistribute power and resources. Also want to express my disappointment in the notion that we must compromise on our proposed solutions before going to the table. I expect any of the industry interests doing the same. First, we must be bold and say what we need, then we fight from there. And those are the ones that I've received so far, everybody.
Thank you so much, Charles. And thank you to the public for those great comments, ideas, actual action steps forward. The committee has heard, they've been read into the record, and we will review the documents that have been submitted along with it. So our sincere appreciation for the ideas and critiques. We need them in order to be stronger, and we really want to ensure that we're hearing from everyone. So thank you, Louisiana. And we are at 12 after 11, and we've got a lot of work to do. We know we got a lot to get caught up on, get ready for, and we know we have another meeting in January. But I wanted to just take this moment to offer my sincere gratitude both to the staff of the governor's office for helping to get all of us aligned and ready and good to go. I know that's not easy. Lindsay and Charles, thank y'all so much. And I also want to extend deep gratitude to the members of this advisory group volunteering to be a part of this process. You have many other things to do. I'm sure phones ringing and emails coming now. And this has been a very rich couple of hours just today. So I just want to say thank you for your love of Louisiana and your love of Louisiana's people and the work that we're going to do together. Principled struggle, some might say, and just want to offer my thanks. Formally, I need to ask for a motion to adjourn. And so I want to see if I can get a motion.
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Colton. May I have a second?
Okay.
Thank you, Steve Cochran. All in favor of adjourning? Can you please come off mute and say aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Great. Any opposed? We'll leave you by yourself? No, just kidding. Any opposed? Okay, great. The ayes have it, and we are officially adjourned. Thank y'all so much for a great first meeting. Please be on the lookout for some notes and information from Lindsay coming directly to you. And I saw two hands really quick, even though we've adjourned. So I don't know what to do here. Lindsay, I saw Dr. Colton and Steve. May I take those questions?
Yes, you can call on them.
We were just
Okay.
voting. That was it.
Oh, was that just a...
Farewell.
Sorry, just kidding. Well, thank y'all so much, and we'll see y'all for the